Go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Madeline Edelman, a professor in Justice Studies, part of the School of Social Transformation. Welcome to Seeking Justice in Arizona for 2023. We're going to launch this year's series with ASU's Land Acknowledgement First.
Arizona State University is located in Indian country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona. ASU's campuses are situated on the homelands of many indigenous peoples, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Peepash.
Arizona State University recognizes the original inhabitants of these lands
and recognizes that they still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area.
And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us.
If you've flown into the valley, you have undoubtedly seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area.
Those modern-day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people, Huhulkam, to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive.
We acknowledge that the modern-day indigenous nations that descended from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land.
Thank you. Sharing a land acknowledgement is an educational and symbolic gesture to make as part of our larger material efforts to realize the robust sovereignty, security, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And today's talk is one of a number of actions that the School of Social Transformation and ASU have taken or will take towards this goal. I invite you, our attendees, to consider what steps you can take individually and collectively to advance tribal sovereignty, security, and well-being. I also like to say thank you to Professor Kwan and to her students for inviting us into her class this afternoon to host the Seeking Justice in Arizona series for the School of Social Transformation for this semester. We are now in our 19th year of hosting this series. Each fall, we invite 3 individuals, groups, organizations, or initiatives to share their chosen pathways to justice, to give each of us a sense of what it's like from the inside, what it's like to be involved in social change efforts. And we are able to explore people's personal stories and backgrounds, their experiences and decisions that have led them to the priorities, the turning points, and the collaborations that they're going to share with us. Each speaker brings insights not only into the particular issues that they work on, but also the strategies and the tactics that they use, how they define and engage power ethically and fairly to benefit the people who are most affected by the entrenched social problems that they take action around. As well, they share their vision for the world that they want to create. In the School of Social Transformation, justice studies as an academic area of inquiry is dedicated to that very gap between the way things are and the way they ought to be, identifying steps that will get us closer to that vision. At the same time, we acknowledge that we don't all share that same vision. And even when we do, that there are multiple pathways toward that vision. Seeking Justice in Arizona allows us to get to know the people doing this work day by day, chipping away at various forms of structural inequality. This year's series is hosted by our Introduction to Justice Studies course. And again, we say thank you for being there and knowing that we'll be able to hear from students' concerns and questions and suggestions towards the end of our time together. Our guest today is Judge Jennifer Jermaine, who won election to the San Marcos Justice Precinct in 2022 and took her oath of office January 3rd, 2023. Judge Jermaine comes to the bench after 2 terms in the Arizona State Legislature. There, she served on the Government, Elections, Reform, and Military and Veterans Affairs Committees. She is a first-generation descendant of the White Earth Nation and chaired Arizona's Study Committee on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Jermaine has a BA in International Business from San Diego State University, a master's in public administration from Arizona State University, and spent years in the nonprofit sector helping people start and succeed in small businesses. She and her family live in Chandler, and this afternoon, among other things, Judge Jermaine will help us reflect on her pursuit of justice for murdered and missing Indigenous people through local, state, and federal legislative and community-based efforts. And I want to welcome Judge Jermaine here and to help us begin the conversation, because naming and language matter so much in how we understand the world and what's possible to even discuss or imagine. Would you please help us by naming the language that you'd like us to use to refer to the people and places who are primary focus of your life and justice efforts? We hear all different kinds of words being used: Indigenous, Native American, Indian, etc. Help us with that language, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elliman. I personally use Indigenous and Native interchangeably. When I'm referring to tribal lands, I refer to specific tribal nations, as in the Navajo Nation, the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, the White Mountain Apache tribe, using their proper titles, and what that specific tribe has decided that their lands are to be called. I try to very closely adhere to what they prefer to be called.
Thank you. We're always trying to listen carefully and try to have some humility in knowing that we don't know everything. So we appreciate that.
Yeah.
As you know, we've prepared a number of questions for you. You have a very large scope of knowledge and experience. So I also will rely on you to help move the conversation forward. I wanted to start off by just saying that you are you're new in your position as a judge in the San Marcos Justice Precinct. Can you tell us what that means? What are your responsibilities? How did you decide to pursue this position? How does it fit into your larger idea of seeking justice?
Yeah, so in Arizona, the justice courts are the lower level division of the state court system. So we are limited jurisdiction. We handle misdemeanor crimes, petty crimes, and we handle protective orders and civil affairs under $10,000. So in Maricopa County, the justice courts are the only ones who are elected officials. If you're going into Superior Court, Appellate Court, or even the Supreme Court, those are appointed, and they're appointed by the governor. But in outer counties, they do elect Superior Court judges, and they do elect Appellate Court judges. And every 4 years, those judges must sit for electoral retention, which allows the people of Arizona to decide whether or not that person remains a judge in Arizona.
Your explanation of our judicial system here in Arizona makes me think that if you're eligible to vote, then registering to do so and actually voting the entire ballot, sometimes you got to turn it over. And the
Yes.
judges are often on the backside. Can you tell us a little bit about how people can be good eligible voters with regards to our judicial system?
Yeah. There are a lot of places where you can get research on the judges. There is a civic group that does a newsletter called Judicial Watch, and they kind of go through all of these various scorecards from all the different groups and compile them into a single newsletter that I personally found really, really good. And it's written by investigative journalists. So they're actually doing good, solid research on who these people are and where they stand on certain positions. There's also the Judicial Conduct Review. There's the Judicial Review Board, which put out lists and grades every year. And all of those can be found through, I believe the website is azcourts.gov.
Thank you. And as a reminder to anyone attending today, we're going to be distributing a list of resources that you have compiled and that we've been adding to as well. So we'll put those on the list too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you help us distinguish between your judicial work and your legislative work?
Yeah, so the legislative work is creating the laws and the judicial work is interpreting and applying the laws. And one of the big things that I'm able to do through the judicial work that I was not able to do through the legislative work is to really have a dramatic impact. One of the things that my court sees the highest volume of is protective orders. So if somebody's coming into the court seeking a protective order for domestic violence, we're able to handle that right then and there. And we went through on the legislative side a couple of years ago and expanded it out so that when you are getting a protective order and there is an intimate partner relationship or a domestic roommate relationship involved, your protective order now lasts for 2 years instead of 1 year. And in the outer counties, they can actually get those through virtual appearances.
That's it sounds innovative. Is Arizona leading the way, or are we catching up, do you think?
A little bit of both. We're leading the way as far as virtual appearances for rural areas. In the time standards, there are states that have their protective orders last until the plaintiff decides to revoke it. And that could be years and years and years. And in Arizona, we only have one type of protective order that lasts for that long. And it is called a lifetime injunction. And you can only get it if there has been a conviction in a violent crime.
So it sounds like you're able to be part of some processes, some tactics to help victims of violence and those who are survivors of violence figure out what the next steps in their lives are. A good amount of the work that you've been doing that we invited you to speak about this afternoon is focused on Indigenous forms of justice, which might not completely align with the state or federal processes that we have created in this country. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the problem at hand. If you could help us understand the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. What's the extent of the problem? What does it look like? What forms does it take? And clearly we're going to take some time to go through the historical and some of the structural factors that affect it. For now, can you help paint the picture so that people who might not know anything about it can get a sense of what we're talking about?
Yeah, so this is a problem that's been happening since the colonization of this land. Where it really gets complicated is in 1978, there was a Supreme Court decision, Oliphant v. Squamish Indian Tribe. And that took prosecution away from the tribes for non-Indian offenders. And offenders know this. So part of what has made our Indigenous populations particularly vulnerable is the lack of prosecution for these crimes committed on tribal lands.
Can you help explain what the offenses are, the things that have been criminalized, perhaps the things that are beyond criminalization? You might have an example to share to help us understand what you mean by missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Yeah, so the crimes that the Elephant case specifically affected in a very dramatic way are defined in the Major Crimes Act of 1885. And that is the act that provides that federal criminal jurisdiction over enumerated crimes if the defendant is Indian. And Oliphant took away that prosecution from tribal courts for murder, assault, causing serious bodily injury, and most sexual offenses. So those are the crimes where tribes cannot prosecute non-Indian offenders.
Which renders people who are living within the sovereignty of a tribe, it constrains their ability to adjudicate, to take care of, to address these harms within their own communities. So can you tell us a little bit about what the tensions might be to have the requirement to lean on a state or federal prosecution?
Late in most recent years, there's been a couple cases and a couple laws that have come through to try to ease some of those issues. So in 2020, McGirt versus Oklahoma upheld the federal jurisdiction on tribal lands. And then in 2022, Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta completely reversed McGirt and brought in an entirely new system. And the tribes are still trying to adjust to that. And part of their response to it was to bake into the Violence Against Women Act 2022 a special tribal criminal jurisdiction, which allows tribes to prosecute these crimes in state courts. So we piloted that program with the Pascua Yaqui tribe beginning back in 2000. And Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community is the second Arizona tribe to come on board with a special criminal jurisdiction. They're allowed to get their prosecutors cross-certified as deputy county attorneys to be able to bring charges in state court.
So if you're not a lawyer and you haven't been to law school, some of these cases or thinking about multi-jurisdictional conflicts might be a little confusing, or we might not understand. So what? Maybe we can bring ourselves back to thinking about the number of people we're talking about. What I've been reading in preparation for our discussion was just an egregiously high number, disproportionate number of Indigenous, Native women and girls who have been targeted with what I think people would call gender-based violence in all different kinds of ways. Can you talk about the extent of the problem we're talking about here?
Yeah, so in 2019, we began research in collaboration with the Research on Violent Victimization Lab at ASU. So all of their research, and this is a collaboration between the School of Criminal Justice, the School of Social Work, and the law school, looking at what is happening specifically in the state of Arizona and seeing if we can fill in some of those data gaps. Because one of the biggest problems with missing and murdered Indigenous people is the lack of data. We cannot crime map this. We cannot predict where our hotspots are. We cannot look at the specific instances within the specific areas because we don't have that data. And that was one of the biggest problems. And that's what led to our bill, HB 2570 being passed, was specifically to look at how we fix the data problem so that we can begin to lay these foundations and fix the system. So looking back with the Research on Violent Victimization Lab, we actually found that in Arizona, there are more men and boys that go missing than women and girls. But specifically looking at our LGBTQ plus community, they are nowhere existent in the data because our state databases and the federal criminal database, the NCIC database, do not track whether somebody is LGBTQ or they're transgender. So we've got another big problem there, trying to figure out what is going on with these communities, because speaking with groups like Navajo Pride, they're absolutely being targeted, but they're disappearing in the data.
It's a double disappearance, it sounds like. It's the victimization that goes silenced or ignored and made invisible, and then there's no tracking at all. So the social silence, and then the silence in the data itself. It sounds like you were collaborating with people who do all different kinds of social research. Could you describe a little bit about the kinds of methods that people were using, and knowing that our students are taking courses about research methods, all different kinds?
One of the big things that we wanted to establish was that we were using proven scientific research-based methods, and we were collaborating with a world-class research institution to do these things. And through the guidance of Jacob Moore at the office of ASU's president, making sure that we are doing it in collaboration with our tribal nations, that we are going to each individual tribal council, presenting our proposal and getting their permission before entering their lands. Making sure that we're doing it properly and we're doing it correctly, and that the data integrity is there, and that we are protecting people's vulnerable stories, and making sure that we're protecting identities for people who may be still in danger. Every one of the researchers who has worked with us has gone through and gotten human-based research certifications through a number of different institutions, and they are all IRB certified.
That's great. I appreciate you invoking our institutional review board at ASU and at other places, thinking about our students who also go through that training. One of the things that we want to delve into a little more is using legislative action to kind of leverage social change. And you very quickly passed over the fact that you were the person who sponsored HB 2570 that passed unanimously in 2019, along with your colleague, Senator Victoria Steele, in the state Senate. Could you give us a little bit of behind the scene understanding of how a bill becomes a law? How did you make that happen?
Yeah, I started working on this issue in 2017 with former Representative Winona Benally, who represented the Navajo Nation. And she's now a prosecutor with the Pascua Yaqui tribe. So she's gone full circle too. But started working with her just as a community member, because I thought I wasn't aware of how common my family's story was when it came to missing and murdered Indigenous people. My great-grandfather went missing from the Yellowstone National Park off of a WAP work site during the Great Depression. There was no investigation. My grandfather searched for his body for 70 years, and we finally found his remains in a pauper's grave in Montana. And we were able to verify it was him through DNA. But there was never an investigation. There was never anything said to the family about him going missing. All of a sudden, his paycheck stopped coming. So for 70 years, nobody knew what happened to him. We were able to DNA test his body and to carbon date some of his remains to find out that he had been deceased the entire time.
So
and as an Indigenous family, I did not know how common those stories were, that somebody goes missing and there's never an investigation. I thought that we were an anomaly. And what I've come to find out is we are not an anomaly, and it's far too common of a story.
So you were able to bring your personal story to this legislative process, which it sounds like it took a couple of years to move from your own awareness and desire to make a change to creating legislation. Can you hold our hands a little bit and bring us through that process?
Yeah, so as community members, we were just starting to come together and exploring this topic. Traditionally, in a lot of tribal communities, talking about the deceased is a taboo subject. You don't say their name because it would recall them from the spirit world. And looking at how generational shifts are starting to change things, we thought it was a good time to maybe start exploring this subject. And just from our community group down at the Capitol, at the Arizona Capitol, working together, every single one of us had a story about a loved one who had gone missing and that there was never an investigation. Nothing was ever done about it. There was no prosecutions. Most of them did not have answers to what happened or where their loved one is. They were just poof, vanished, gone. So we started putting together a framework of, okay, what can we do to further look into these projects? And then when Winona Benali decided not to run again, she asked myself and Victoria Steele to please continue working on this. And just being a freshman legislator, I walked right into the speaker's office and I said, I know I'm a freshman, but if I only get one hearing on one bill this year, can I talk to you about this one bill? So I started talking with then Speaker Rusty Bowers about it, only to find out that in his youth, on his mission up with the Prescott Yavapai tribe, he knew women who went missing and had never been heard from again. So it was almost as if it was meant to be, that this was a perfect timing for all of this to start going through. And he personally helped guide it through the legislature. And as a freshman member of the minority political party, to have a bill pass unanimously and then to have a signing ceremony with the governor and representatives from 22 tribal nations was quite extraordinary.
For anyone interested in observing that momentous occasion, you can find the video on YouTube. It's quite moving. Congratulations, Judge Jermaine, on that. I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's certainly unique. And it's building on the painful losses in your family and in many other families. I'm curious. A lot of us talk about wanting to do research and use data to change the world. And data can come in all different kinds of forms. It sounds to me that you used all different kinds of numbers and stories. So I wonder if you'd share maybe some more, whether it's numbers and or stories with us to help us get a full picture of what you're talking about.
Yeah, one of the things we really wanted to look at is, why was the data missing? Why was it not being collected in the first place? So we went through and met with every single tribal government. We met with every single police chief from the tribal nations and said, walk me how you do these investigations, what forms do you use, what's going on here, which in Arizona, we have tribes that are under section, it's Public Law 638. And yeah, Public Law 638, which allows tribes to create their own police departments, create their own court systems. But we also have tribes that are under FBI and Department of Justice jurisdiction. And we also have tribes that are under Bureau of Indian Affairs jurisdiction. But if you look at places like California, all of their tribes are under a Public Law Section 280 jurisdiction, which is a state and tribal criminal jurisdiction. And these are federal codes. But looking at where the jurisdictions lie, looking at a lot of our tribal lands, because of the Dawes Act of 1887, are checkerboarded. So you can literally have 1 foot in tribal land and 1 foot in a county island. And whose jurisdiction does that body fall under? And that's where we were finding there were issues, is when we were crossing jurisdictional lines, where we were crossing prosecutorial lines, and where agencies just were not communicating with each other.
It sounds like there's at least two areas that we have to understand better. One is the issues involved with these multiple jurisdictions. You know, where's the person from? Where were they working? Where were they walking? Where did the crime itself happen? Where is the person's remains? Where were they taken to, perhaps? That's kind of one area. What happens after the fact? And then all of the kind of conditions and history and current dynamics that generate the violence to begin with.
Yes.
So we've taken a little bit of time talking about the jurisdictions. I know there's so much more to talk about, and we can get back to that. Could you help us understand those conditions, the histories that contribute to or generate the violence itself?
Yes. So I will take you back to Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which is the federal government's power to sign treaties with tribal nations. And it was first upheld in the 1830s by the Marshall Supreme Court, and most recently upheld during our current Supreme Court. And we'll take you back to 1830 and looking at the Indian Removal Act, which most people know as the Trail of Tears. That was the forcible relocation of most of the tribes from the southern states up to Oklahoma, and then looking forward a little bit, the Indian Civilization Act of 1869, which is what created the Indian boarding school systems in this country. And they were established under the War Department. And General Richard Henry Pratt was the first superintendent of that system. And the philosophy was, the stated purpose of that system was to kill the Indian to save the man. They purposefully removed children from their families, stripped away their culture, their language, everything that made them who they were, and broke them as human beings. This was systematic cultural genocide. And that's been recognized. It was recognized in the 1960s Kennedy report on the system, and it was recognized again during the Trump administration, actually. And then reaffirmed during the Biden administration that this was systematic cultural genocide of our tribal nations. And when you look back at what causes problems, it's the systematic destruction of the family unit. That leads to things like substance abuse. It leads to parents not knowing how to parent and kids not knowing how to be kids. And people just not knowing where they place in their societal structures. And that has caused generations upon generations of trauma. You look back at the fact that Native Americans were not citizens of this country until 1924, and that the final barriers to being able to vote in the state of Arizona were not removed until 1978, and that the Phoenix Indian School closed in the 1990s.
For folks who are driving around our area, we often use the road that's called Indian School Road, and you may not even have in your mind that it means something, that it refers to something.
Yes, Indian School Road connects the edge of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community to Phoenix Indian School, and then out to the edge of the Tohono O'odham Nation on the west side. It was literally the road that they used to transport Indians to the Indian school.
It's something that's chilling to reflect on in our everyday lives. Perhaps the next time any of us are on that street, walking, taking a bus, in our cars, can think about the kind of
Mhm.
of pain and trauma that has been transferred, as you're saying, across the generations.
Yeah, and when you look back, by 1926, an estimated 83% of all Native American children were in these schools. And the ones who weren't, and this is the Hopi tribe, they actually incarcerated parents at Alcatraz because they refused to send their children to these schools.
I think it's really important to think about these layers of history and this legacy of colonial and genocidal targeting when we address the problem of violence against Indigenous and Native peoples, whether women, girls, trans, two-spirit, lesbian, or gay.
Mhm.
Too often it's really easy to say, oh, well, let's blame the victim. Let's
Yeah.
blame individual family, as opposed to this larger legacy. So I'm wondering what you have learned from your own experience and from the research and advocacy that you've been doing around how best to understand this dynamic of the history, the policy
Yeah.
legacies, and the personal.
Yeah, it's complicated, and you can't really understand it unless you understand some of the history and how this has been baked into our system of government for the last 250 years. And it's not until very recently that we've seen some of these things corrected. So in 1994, Congress finally passed federal recognition of tribal nations. 1994. In 1996, they were allowed to self-govern themselves.
1996 was 28 years ago, approximately. Yeah.
It's not a long history going back to when tribes have gotten rights under our federal government.
What was the more, let's say, surprising, or you learned anew when you were involved in this collaborative research between the tribes and ASU and the legislature?
I think it's when the FBI does end up prosecuting under the Major Crimes Act for these crimes, the maximum sentences are 12 years. You can commit capital murder and you're only going to get 12 years. And that's not a big deterrent. So those are things that need to be fixed. And we've got amazing congressional delegations that are working on this. Senator Mark Kelly's office and Kirsten Sinema's office are working on it. Congressman Greg Stanton over in the House has been working on it. Congressman Ruben Gallego has been working on it. Just making sure that prior to him leaving Congress, Congressman Tom O'Halloran has been working on it. Congressman Andy Biggs has been working on it. But looking at holding people accountable for their actions and getting justice for families of these violent, horrific crimes. But that's one of the reasons why too, we went through and passed the lifetime injunction in the state of Arizona, because even if somebody is convicted in federal court, you can take that federal court conviction over to a superior court in whatever county you live in and file for a lifetime injunction against harassment and make sure that that person, if they ever try to contact you again, is now committing a new felony and can be prosecuted in state court for that felony.
Could you give us a sense a little bit of the types of violence that you're referring to? And you talked about the criminal codes before, which are kind of generic, assault and things like that.
Yeah.
But maybe add some some texture to that in
Yeah.
terms of the crimes we're talking about? Yeah.
So looking at rape, strangulation, abduction, being held against one's will, being drugged against your will.
So those are the kind of crimes that, from my understanding of the study of crime, often happen between people who know each other.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little bit to the known versus unknowns in the relationships here?
When we went through with the Research on Violent Victimization Lab and looked at the cases that were existing within the databases, the largest perpetrator victim relationship was unknown. So not that they were intimate partners, it was that there was no data on what that relationship was between the victim and the perpetrator.
So the unknown there is not whether they were strangers, it's that the data wasn't, the data weren't collected, or they weren't able to figure it out. Maybe they didn't know who the perpetrator was, so you can't decide what the relationship is.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's part of the missing data problem, is that these things are just not being recorded. So it's a retraining of our law enforcement agencies and our social service agencies to record this data and to make sure that we have a qualified nurse in every hospital that can collect a rape kit, that we have somebody who can walk people through the systems as to sexual trauma, that we have victim specialists in every jurisdiction to be able to help victims navigate these systems, because they're complicated.
It sounds like there's all different kinds of paths for people to get involved. And we have a few more minutes for just a couple more questions. I know that our students and other attendees want to submit questions. The folks who are in the classroom will do so by speaking out loud and or submitting their questions into the chat. And people who are attending virtually can also submit their questions into the chat, and we'll include just as many as we can before we're done. Before we do so, I wondered if you could speak to the idea of persistence. You've been thinking about and engaging in this work on multiple levels for a very, very long time. What do you do to sustain yourself? How do you stay in this? What kinds of practices or habits do you have that we might be able to learn from for you to sustain yourself?
I mean, I've got a good, solid, beautiful circle of people around me who I can go to and talk things through, or who I can vent to. And sometimes that is the biggest thing, is making sure that you have people around you who you trust and who are those safe people that you can talk to at all times about anything. I do a lot of reading, and a lot of my recommendations are on the list of research materials that you guys will get at the end of the class. But a lot of reading, a lot of education. I go to conferences and learn from other people. I've had the opportunity to sit with our Secretary of the Interior and to discuss my family's history with MMIP and my family's history with the boarding school system, and how the Indian Relocation Act of 1956 affected my family. And when we're looking at urban natives, which is what I usually refer to myself as, I'm Ojibwe, my homelands are in northern Minnesota, but as an urban native, and most of us came this way through the 1956 Relocation Act, and that's where the government paid Native Americans to give up their rights to their reservation lands. So my grandfather took the money, signed away all of his rights and all of his descendants' rights to our tribal homelands, and moved out west. where he could blend into society and his children would not be forced into the boarding school system. That was the deal he made with the federal government. I don't blame him for that. But looking at how that impacts areas and how that intersects with MMIP, Phoenix was one of the 6 major relocation centers. We have the largest Indian center in the nation. We have the oldest Indian center in the nation here in Central Phoenix. They're right across from the old Indian school. But looking at those services that were provided through those centers to try to bring together urban communities, because you have well over 400 tribes represented in the Phoenix urban community. But making sure that we were not, when we were doing this research, we were not ignoring those people who live in the urban society and who are often in the jurisdictions of urban law enforcement departments and county courts.
We do have questions already coming in, which is great, and we're going to shift over in just a moment. I appreciate you talking about your own personal practices and habits, and the fact that we have needs as social advocates, as activists for change. We can't be machines doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
It does affect our souls and our well-being. One of the things that comes to my mind from your comments about trying to shore up, clarify, enhance jurisdictional control or forms of punishment for accountability reminds me that in justice studies, we have all different kinds of theories of justice and
Mm-hmm.
ways of holding people accountable. And given that the criminal justice system could be considered another form of social control of a very, very vulnerable population that's already been the target of the state, some people might suggest that we should move away from the criminal justice system as our locus of activism. So could you comment, please, on maybe a both-and approach that you're taking, or how this works for you?
So one of the things that we did with HB 2570 is we were looking at a both approach. We were looking at approaching this from both ends, from a social perspective, working with our community organizations and our activist groups, but also at a systems perspective, looking at where the holes and the gaps were in the existing structures and systems. During our initial research, one of the things that we found was that 80% of our victims were parents. So what happened to those children? Looking at ICWA, looking at the problems with DCS, looking at how we ensure that families are able to heal and care and get services to those children who are left behind, looking at our school system and adding social workers and psychologists and counselors to those areas where we have high numbers of these crimes to be able to meet the needs of those children who are left behind. Because trauma impacts their ability to learn, it impacts their ability to function in daily life, and it impacts their ability to go on. And if they can't work through their trauma and have somebody safe that they can talk to about it, that they can trust and learn from, they're going to be stuck in their trauma for the rest of their life. But really looking at the whole person and the whole center and the entire case, because the person who is at the center of that case is not the only victim. We're looking at the children, the parents, the grandparents who are now caring for the children. And where are those holes? Where are those gaps in our education system, in our healthcare system? We did a wonderful session with ER doctors on how to spot human trafficking and how to safely intervene with human trafficking. Did some really great work, and the work is continuing with Indian Health Services and with our rural hospitals on having these education systems put in place. And the University of Arizona, which operates the Arizona Centers for Health Education, is now bringing on board people who can do the training of healthcare professionals on how to perform these rape exams. And one of the biggest gaps that we found in our rural healthcare system is for pediatric providers. So a pediatric rape exam is quite different from one on an adult, and you need somebody who is specialized and trained in how to do that and how to care for those children. And we just, outside of Maricopa County and Pima County, those were not available. And how horrific and traumatic and re-traumatizing is it to have a child that you now need to take to 4 different hospitals because they don't have the resources to provide the exam that child needs. So where are we filling the holes in those gaps that are available in our social services? And then also just looking at housing, employment, food stability, those all come into play when you're looking at domestic violence. So in times of economic downturn, we see domestic violence shoot up. We know this. It is a known. How can we intervene and how can we provide those resources in those communities? And we saw in 2021, for the very first time, the state of Arizona granting them money to tribal nonprofits who are working on these areas in their local communities. We saw the state of Arizona funding domestic violence shelters on tribal lands. Our tribal citizens are citizens of the state of Arizona as well. They pay their taxes. They deserve to have the services as well.
I think you've given us a kind of a spherical, global kind of understanding of how all these different sectors and parts of one's life overlap and inform the kind of vulnerabilities and victimization and the perpetration of violence as well. We have people who are in our classroom who may want to ask their questions live on a microphone. So I wanted to invite them to get set to do that. And while they're doing that, I'm going to just share a couple of questions, and then you can decide what kind of order you want to answer them in. We have questions regarding how our community can get educated and spread awareness of this issue. So kind of a public messaging idea. You and I spoke earlier about the red hand injury, so maybe you can talk about that a little bit. And then there's also questions specifically about Governor Hobbs's Missing and Murdered Indigenous People Task Force, and wondering what the status of that was, and is that a effective place for some of this work?
So a good way to spread education in the community, start with the programs that are already existing. So May 5th of every year has been deemed National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Day. There is an event at the Arizona State Capitol on the Capitol grounds. It's an educational event, it's a community event where they bring together all of the groups that are working on these issues and have a summit for one day. And then they have a cultural event at the end of the night where there are performances and songs, and it is a very wonderful community event. And ASU took the lead last year and really helped to move that along. So start with existing events. Our people are very open and willing to talk about these issues. Cassie Harvey over at the Research on Violent Victimization Lab, she's the lab manager. Sit down with her, she'll talk to you about anything. But she's been a great resource for us to have based at ASU, and really helping to kind of create these programs. Rosetta Walker, who is over at the American Indian Studies program, she is a phenomenal resource into finding these already existing events within the community where you can go and educate yourself. And then as far as the governor's task force, they are picking up from where the legislative committee left off. So they are going into the agencies and making rule changes and making structural changes within the agencies to better address some of these issues. I don't know how much the class has heard about the sober living home crisis that is going on in Arizona right now. This was something that our task force discovered. We had people come out and testify about it. And it's quite a large amount of money that was schemed off of the Indian healthcare system, where it meets with our Medicaid program access. And Native people were being targeted. They were being abducted from tribal lands and held against their will. And their insurance benefits were being milked for services that were not being provided in these fake sober living homes. And Department of Health has since suspended over 200 licenses. And the Attorney General's office is seeking they've brought criminal indictments against a number of people who were ringleaders in this scheme. But the task force has been working specifically on that, has taken a large precedence right now.
Thank you, Judge Jermaine. There was a question about, are there any notable or upcoming legislative or judicial actions that will impact the Indigenous community or communities in peoples in Arizona? Anything that folks should be looking out for?
Yes. We just passed it through the Arizona Supreme Court, a rule change for the rules of evidence for the state courts for Arizona, that we have what is called self-authenticating documents that are produced by government entities. The state of Arizona is now the third state in the nation to recognize those government entities include tribal nations. So now your certificate of Indian blood, for example, is a self-authenticating document, meaning that you do not have to have somebody from the enrollment office come testify that you are Native American. Your marriage decree from your tribal nation is now a self-authenticating document, and you can take it to any state court and get a divorce without having to have somebody from your tribal council come and testify that that's an official document. So we're looking at, and that will become effective. We passed it 2 weeks ago, and it will become effective in the state of Arizona on January 1st of next year.
It does show you that bureaucracy shapes our lives in the most quotidian and most poignant ways. I'm waiting for my colleagues to let us know if there are people who want to ask questions live in the classroom.
Okay.
Let's see if people want to raise their hands and let us know if you have a question you want to ask live in the classroom, please. You're also welcome to submit things in the chat, but we'd love to hear your voice.
Okay, try it again, HQ.
We hear you.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much, Jermaine. What a privilege it is to have you in our class. I was wondering, and this is really a kind of an extending Dr. Edelman's last question, which is, really these issues, as you show us, extraordinarily complex and difficult. Can you talk to us about what restorative justice or transformative justice approaches would look like? What if you could snap your finger and make things happen your way? What would justice look like?
Oh my gosh, justice would look like believing victims when they come forward. Justice would look like arresting and prosecuting perpetrators. Justice would look like taking care of the children who are left behind and ensuring that they have the social constructs and the educational ability to create a life for themselves. Right now, a lot of that is not happening. And those were some of the gaps that we were looking to fix and we're looking to fill. And unfortunately, working within government means that sometimes you're taking incremental steps. But continuously taking those incremental steps and having them add up mean big leaps and gains. If we look back over the last 20 years in tribal law and in just the rights that we have as Native Americans, our ability to address these issues has grown substantially in the last 20 years with the legislative changes and with electing Native Americans to public office. I mean, my court sits at the border to the Gila River Indian community. I should not be the first Native American to be sitting in my court. I should not be the first woman to be sitting in my court. But I'm both of those things.
You point to the notion of we want more first, but not, they shouldn't be the first, and we want to figure out ladders and bridges that we can build so that you're not the last.
Exactly. So through my role as a judge in Maricopa County, I get to appoint justice pro tems, which are basically our substitute judges who come in on days we're not able to be there. So for me, I have specifically recruited justice pro tems from the Gila River Indian community and from the Pascua Yaqui tribal community, because those are the tribes that are within the jurisdiction of my court. And they deserve to be represented at that table. And this is a way that I can keep the door open and invite others in.
Thank you very much.
We have a question about people want to contact you. If we're also interested in all kinds of professional opportunities, things like internships. So if someone was wondering if they're going to go to law school or other kind of pathways, what kind of next steps do you recommend for students and others who are listening this afternoon?
If you would have asked me 10 years ago if this was going to be my path, I would have said no way. So don't limit yourself. I've kind of learned and moved with the way the world has been taking me with a yes and. Improv, learning from the world of improv, yes and looking at where opportunities present themselves. And you know what, if somebody slams a door in your face, go look for that window and see how you build yourself a ladder to get out that window. There are opportunities that exist, and as a First Native to walk through these ways, it is I feel my job to keep that door open for you guys. I should not be the last. And for me to be the first, I want to bring 20 people along with me, because it's about fair and equal representation within government and looking at systems and structures that were designed for you to never be involved in the first place. My great-grandfather was born in Minnesota, was not a citizen of this country. On the day he died, he was not a citizen of this country. I don't think that he could have ever imagined me being in this position in his entire wild imagination.
Judge Jermaine, you're pointing out the limitations and the bluntness of our legal system and the tools that it entails. And you're also encouraging us to take advantage of those same systems and tools, along with other ways of pursuing justice. And that's the of this series. I'm just doing a double check of our chat. We have some people saying thank you for your comments, and Another person's asking, based on the fact that the bill that you had sponsored, the 2570, if I'm remembering correctly, back in 2013, had there been previous efforts, previous bills that had addressed a similar issue, but maybe didn't make it? Maybe the timing wasn't right. Maybe the speaker wasn't Rusty Brower at the time. Maybe there wasn't a partnership with ASU, et cetera. So can you maybe rewind a little?
In Arizona, there were not previous bills. Mine was the first to be introduced. We were the second state in the nation to pass such a bill. We were a couple of months behind Washington State. Washington State's looked at it from purely a law enforcement perspective. We wanted to go beyond that and to look at the social constructs and the total determinants of health behind it. And to take a real holistic view at it, mostly because of the lived experiences of members of the committee. And we were a unconventional committee for our state legislature because we blended both elected legislators, we blended elected tribal officials, and we brought the activist groups from the community to the table and gave them seats and a podium. So making sure that we were including all voices, and I did get chided multiple times for having a committee that was too large. But in reality, we could not have looked at all of these issues if we did not have all of these voices at the table. And we purposefully brought in a research institution and brought in ASU because we needed somebody to come in with those research methods, with the IRB, with making sure that we were working with tribal governments hand in hand as equal partners to approach this. And very rarely do you get 22 tribal nations agreeing on something. This was something that every single one of them agreed to come on board and do. And that was a historic moment within the state of Arizona, that every single one of our tribal nations stood up and said, yes, this is an issue, along with all of our 3 metropolitan Indian centers said, and it's an issue for us. And please look at us too. Because we have unique problems as opposed to rural Arizona tribal nation problems, because we don't have the structures behind us to fall back on.
It sounds like you figured out how to navigate a system that wasn't built or intended to have you in it, or your concerns. And so I just want to share that some students and faculty and others who are attending remain concerned about the use of these kinds of systems for achieving Native or Indigenous justice. One person used the phrase, how can we create justice in a neocolonial institution? I'm not sure we'll resolve that this afternoon, but we want to know that there's differences of opinion here about working within and working from without. So I'm just curious about your experience, your
And in my experience, it needs to be both. It needs to come from both ends. We need the people who are working outside of the system to push the system, but we also need people inside the system to enact those changes and to create a fairer justice system and to create pathways. So it needs to be a both strategy, in my opinion. It doesn't work if you're only doing one strategy. It needs to be an all strategy.
Thinking about that, noticing that we have our another first Indigenous cabinet member in the Biden administration, our fellow Southwestern neighbor, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who is working with the Not Invisible Act Commission, that some folks who are attending might want to do a little homework and get more information about that as well. Thinking about this on multiple levels, inside and outside. How can we do the work in ways that are meaningful and adhering to our own value system? Judge Jermaine, I want to say thank you on behalf of the School of Social Transformation We're really, really grateful to you for sharing your time and energy today. And I do believe that you've raised a lot of our awareness and challenged us to think about these issues in a more complex, more historical, more contextualized kind of way. And you've also given us some concrete steps. And as we said before, we're going to circulate the resources that you mentioned that you've generated, including that report that ASU and the committee put out together. We're going to share those links to all these attendees. The recording of your comments will be placed on our Seeking Justice website for anyone who wants to look at it as well. I would not want to leave without saying thank you to our fantastic staff, namely Brittany, Haley, Jennifer, and Gina, for making the magic of a Zoom webinar that happens both in person and remotely take place, I hope, for everyone involved in a smooth way. So thank you very much. And before we leave, I also want to invite you all to join us next month when we have our second speaker in the series. The CEO of the Arizona Center for Disability Law will be joining us on Monday, October 23rd. Also at 1:30 in the afternoon, Arizona time. And Mr. JJ Rico will be talking about why he pursues disability justice through the enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and how some of these local and national efforts have changed or stayed the same since the ADA went into effect about 33 years ago. You are welcome to register by scanning that QR code. And if we're able to coordinate, we're also going to put the registration link in the chat. But for now, I will close by saying, again, thank you to my colleague, Professor Kwan, and all the students who are attending in person and remotely, along with our community members, both on and beyond the campus of ASU. We will see you next month. Thank you so much. I think we're going to stop our recording at this time.